Okay, we're live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week's topic is the 1932-1933 parallel currency experiment in Wörgl, Austria. So what they did was they took a bunch of Austrian shillings, put them in the bank, and then created notes. They called them labor certificates that were IOUs for these shillings that were in the bank. So instead of the government spending the shillings directly to fund its programs, et cetera, they would pay their workers using these labor certificates. And on its own, that sounds really boring because you've just replaced a shilling with a labor certificate, and what's special about that? But what's special about that is they had an extra feature where at the end of the month, you had to pay 1% of the value of the note in order to get it stamped, in order to be able to use it again. So you had to get these stamps at the end of the month in order to keep being able to spend the notes. And the idea with that is that people wouldn't save them, they would spend them. It would encourage them to keep kind of circulating the currency in the local economy. And it was a local currency that was only accepted within this one town and maybe some closely adjacent areas. But the idea, another way of thinking about it is that it's money that pays a negative interest rate on it. So if you have money in the bank, maybe you get bank pays you a little bit every month or every year or something. But this is the opposite. If you're holding on to it, you have to pay. So it's money that has a negative interest rate associated with it. So what we want to explore today is, we have an article by Bernard Lietaer, who actually died recently, but he's an expert on this kind of stuff. And he's kind of pushing for more of these kinds of complementary currencies, especially with the negative interest rate, which is also sometimes called demurrage. So we're going to be discussing that, and we have quotes from the article, and then we're also going to be talking about, well, what can we learn from this? How does it apply to the real world? Because this is a basic income group, and we know one of the main features of basic income is that it allows more money to flow in the economy. So there's some similarity there. So what I want to start by doing is going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts on complementary currency, this kind of demurrage, negative interest rate, and the Wörgl experiment in particular, either just thoughts about that or how it relates to basic income. So we'll go in the same order we did the introductions. So it'll be Bethany, Martin, Derek, Janae, Richard, Soraya, Steve, and then we'll do Mom, Elizabeth, Austin, and Mitchell. So go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, so quick question. Did you say they printed more of it than they had reserves also, or just had this demurrage feature? No, they didn't.
They did not, yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I'm interested in different aspects of a separate currency. One is this question of whether you can kind of print your own money with it, which it sounds like they didn't do in terms of expanding, but the other one is sort of promoting spending in this way. And I guess my initial thought is that it seems like there would be, it seems like there's maybe a root problem that it's not addressing, even if it has some benefit, because people want to spend what they want to spend. And it seems like there must be another way to kind of give them enough money that there's enough demand in the economy. If you're really trying to promote spending beyond what people want to do, then that I think brings up some of the topics we were talking about last week, which is like, why are you pushing spending for its own sake? I mean, that's just kind of like using up resources. If people didn't even want to spend it without kind of an extra incentive, that sort of is a little bit of a red flag for me that you're maybe getting things backwards fundamentally. But I'm interested in exploring that more. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Good thoughts. Martin, go ahead.
So, I'm going to leave some of the comment to maybe more people who have a more near-term focus than I do. And I think what I'll do, though, is I'll just sort of pose the question of what can we learn about UBI under today's conditions, or looked at the other way around. If there were UBI today, what would be different with what the world is going through today with the virus pandemic? And I'd also ask the question, would it be possible conceptually to do what I might call a global reset, where it's like rebooting your computer. So you reboot the global economy as if whatever we finally determine is the virus crisis period, say 1 January through some arbitrary date, and you just do this notional global economic reset, go back to January 1st, not with respect to the virus, of course, but with respect to the world economy. And I know that's just kind of ephemeral, but anyway, that's a thought experiment.
Okay, cool. So we'll do Derek and then Janae and then Richard.
Well, this is very interesting. The main thing I maybe want to do is read more about it, and that if just from a quick glance, there didn't seem to be a lot of literature out there about it. But I think it's interesting for a lot of reasons, just for all sorts of separate topics here, like, well, the fact that a small local government is kind of using an exploit to issue its own currency, to add a modification to that currency. That's really interesting just to see how that goes about. I'm really interested in how it mentions that this sort of terminated when the central monetary authority sort of put the kibosh on it after other towns were interested. So would be really interested to hear kind of more about the motivations of central planners who decided to do that, like what they were afraid of happening. And yeah, I'd like to learn more about this stamp mechanism and how it incentivizes the spending of it, and also just probably a relevant factor is that this is occurring during the Great Depression. So there's probably, I suppose, there's more of a deflationary concern in the macro context. I don't know exactly what was going on in Germany at this time. So it'd be interesting to think about it, like if this was successful, was it successful in sort of like breaking free of a larger problem? Those are the first things that come to mind.
Cool. Yeah, I like those questions. We'll do Janae and then Richard and then Soraya.
Hey, so I mean, I admit I am just catching up on the reading right now. But something that's catching my interest is how they were using, it was saying how they go ahead and start using it to improve their own town. They even built new houses, a ski jump and a bridge. And I mean, that's an interesting concept that I feel like hasn't been that I've never really heard in terms of like a basic income, of how that can then kind of, like we always think about it of how it benefits the individual, but then how does it maybe encourage progress on a bigger scale? I don't know. That's just a thought that I had.
Cool, great. Soraya and then, or sorry, Richard and then Soraya and then Steve.
As for what Janae just said, in Kenya, they actually put their money into a fund, and then they built like post offices and things. So that's sort of like what they were doing in Wörgl. And well, how this goes with relates to basic income is, well, when this article was written, in 2010, there was right during the Occupy Wall Street movement and things like that, and people wanted to reform the economy because it wasn't really working, and that was starting to show right now how it's not particularly working very well for a lot of people. And so what let's see, Martin was talking about, he wanted a sort of like a debt jubilee on January 1st, where all the debts and things are like discounted or mostly discounted.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, it's. I think Martin was more saying that not just a debt jubilee for all the debt that's happening right now, but like look at where the economy was on January 1st, and then how do you kind of like force it back to where it was so that we can kind of like start over without a pandemic or something like that. But yeah, so let's go to Soraya and then Steve and then Mom.
Yeah, so I guess, can you guys hear me, Tanya?
Yeah, you're a little quiet though.
Okay, sorry. I had taken off my headset. Sorry.
Okay, I apologize about that. I had taken off my headset, thought it'd be easier. But yeah, my questions, I think Derek, you were saying like how would this actually be enforced? Like, how can you actually do it now? I guess I'd like to talk about that, like, because not that it doesn't seem feasible. I just, how like, what's the wording? What's the verbiage? How do you show that this actually would be beneficial to everyone? Like, I think it would be great, but I definitely do see a lot of negatives. I don't think that our current economic system is fine right now. However, for the way, especially, a lot of these other countries that have done it, it's never been countrywide. It's always been like a specific, demographic, or only the lower income people, were able to receive it. So, how, like, why are we saying that this would go to all citizens? You know what I mean? Just, yeah, lots of questions like that. And then I think with like, so how Maricade had it, Wörgl had it, just like the separate currency. I think something like that would make more sense, at least now. So, to kind of talk more about that, but I guess, are we just going back to food stamps basically? Because food stamps, again, used to physically be a stamp you ripped off and then gave to the grocery store instead of like actual money on an EBT card. And then again, this is like subsidized. So when people swipe that, that money comes from somewhere, but it's like costs less than like it's not a dollar to dollar ratio. So yeah, what, like, where would this actual money be coming from? Or would it be a separate currency that can only be used for American goods or certain supplies? I think something like that could be more feasible, or at least something that's able to be enacted short term. But then how do we get that long term? How do we promote that it's not forced spending and actual just trying to lift people out of poverty?
Yeah, let me actually respond to some of that right now, because it's more about general basic income stuff. So the idea with basic income is that if it goes to everyone, then nobody falls through the cracks. You're not going to end up in a situation where there are people who qualify for some kind of targeted program or should qualify, but they weren't able to, like, logistically fill out the paperwork or something like that. If the government fails to do anything, it's not going to be failing to give people their basic income. So you can do income targeting if you want in the economy in general. I think it's just more efficient to do it on the taxation side. So instead of not giving the money to rich people, if you wanted them to have less money, you just tax them more. So you can still get the same distributional outcomes with basic income. It's just on the payment side, it goes to everyone, and then on the taxation side, you can do the targeting. And then we can have an argument about what kind of different progressive taxes or whatever makes sense, but that's maybe a separate issue, because the basic income just goes to everyone evenly. And you mentioned for it going for it funding people's spending, wanting it to lift people out of poverty versus just funding their spending. I think basic income is not about lifting people out of poverty. It's about helping the economy function efficiently, and the economy is already a giant anti-poverty machine. The fact that we have poverty at all is because the economy is broken. So the basic income funds people's spending in the economy, and then what the spending does, if people are actually able to spend, and buy the things they need, they're not going to fall into poverty. So the spending covers, the basic thing is, to be not poor. The way to be not poor is to have money, right? Or at least that's one of the main things. But then it also funds other spending, because there's, where we draw the line between who's poor and who's not is somewhat arbitrary. Why wouldn't we want to, promote human prosperity as much as possible? So that's kind of like the motivation, or at least what I think of as the motivation of basic income, that the economy is already a giant anti-poverty machine, and basic income helps it work correctly. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So sorry about that. So let's go to Steve, and then Mom, and then Elizabeth.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. One technical question is, people who are paid in the local currency, why don't they just immediately cash it in for the national currency? And I have a more open-ended question of, in America today, how well can you live on just the local economy? Because if you have a local currency, there's no reason that Amazon or Walmart or McDonald's needs to accept your local currency. Only local businesses are, but I'm not sure in America there's enough local businesses to to survive anymore.
Yeah, those are great questions. To answer your first question, I don't think it says this in the article, but what they did was they charged a fee for converting your labor certificates, your Wörgl labor certificates, back into the Australian shillings in the bank. So you could do it, but you had to pay 2%. I think it was 2%. So it was you'd be sacrificing some amount of money in order to convert it back into the shillings. So that creates an incentive for people to spend the money instead of converting it, because then you get the full shilling amount. And in terms of your question about to what extent can you live on a local economy, I think that's a great question and super relevant because we're more globalized than we were back then. So we'll probably get into that more in the discussion. Let's go to Mom, and then Elizabeth, and then Austin, then Mitchell, then Fred, then Eddie.
Yeah, so I had a couple of things. I have to admit, I only scanned the article, so more things will come up, I'm sure, as we talk. But maybe this has been discussed, but I don't know what the problem was that this was designed to solve. And I don't know why there needed to be more money infused into the economy. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I'm thinking about the Gresham dollar and how holding on to it would be a negative, your mechanism that you invented for it, and that it had to be spent in order to be viable, and holding on to it was created a deficit, personal deficit. So in a way, it's similar. It's better if you spend it. Here you get a 1% interest. No, yes, if you spend it. And in yours, I think it was that it started to lose value the more you held on to it. No, okay. Well, I don't remember all of it. I just think it's somewhat parallel, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about that or draw any parallels. But the first thing is, what's it designed to solve?
Yeah, so I mean, it was the Great Depression. It was designed to get the economy going again. So they were focused, as many people are. They were focused on jobs, getting jobs for people. So there were a lot of people unemployed, and there was a lot of important work that wasn't getting done at the same time. And the Wörgl city government didn't really have enough money to pay people to do all the work they wanted it done in their town. So instead of spending the shillings directly, they spent these labor certificates, and then the labor certificates got spent within the economy. So it created even more economic activity of people doing work for each other because everyone wanted to spend this money. So one of the biggest problems in the Great Depression was that nobody wanted to spend their money. Because they were worried about losing their jobs, and then it was kind of this self-perpetuating cycle. Now you've introduced money that people really, really want to spend, because if they don't, they have to pay the 1% at the end of the month every month. So that's kind of the problem that it's designed to solve.
Okay.
Yeah, the Great Depression. It's designed to solve the Great Depression.
Yeah. Okay.
Or that's kind of the hope. That was their hope, and I think they got some of the results they wanted for the short time that it was in existence. As to the Gresham comparison. It's a little bit different. Gresham doesn't penalize you for holding on to the money at all. In fact, you can, so for those who aren't familiar, I designed a complementary currency system for the purpose of implementing basic income. That's just kind of designed, and the design is there, and then if anyone wants to implement it, they can. But the way it works is that it's backed by dollars, just like the labor certificates in Wörgl are backed by Austrian shillings, not Australian. Sorry, Austin. Yeah, Austin's there. Okay. Yeah. So but instead of it being 1-to-1, like there's a fixed amount of dollars in the reserve, and then there's a fixed amount of the Gresham currency. The Gresham currency can expand in much the same way that we had more dollars circulating than there was gold to back it up when we were on the dollar standard. So with Gresham, instead of at the end of the month paying you know, having to pay 1% of the value of each unit of currency, you actually get rewarded for holding on to it. You can actually, you're not allowed to exchange it for dollars until you go through, you know, until you hold on to it for a month. So the
Okay,
incentive,
yeah.
the incentive to spend it isn't that you pay some penalty if you don't. It's that if you're worried that we don't have enough dollars to back it up,
Right.
if you're worried that the system's going to collapse, you want to
Yeah.
spend it instead of holding on to it and hoping to get your dollars. You want to spend it at the full value before that happens.
Yeah.
So it's more about kind of so there is a penalty that you potentially pay and the risk of the system collapsing. So then that creates an incentive for people to keep spending the money. Anyway, we don't need to talk about more about that.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
thanks.
so there's some important differences there, but there's similarities too in that you have this parallel currency that's backed by the base currency of the economy, that's backed by reserves. Yeah. So let's go to Elizabeth, then Austin, then Mitchell.
I think I'll probably pass. I also only sort of skimmed the article, and I think some of the questions I had have already been raised, and so I don't think in this moment that I have anything additional to add.
Okay, great. Let's do Austin, Mitchell, Fred, and then Eddie.
Hey, I'll just say that I think local currencies are a really interesting question, and the one that sort of plagued my brain, because it almost seems like it's sort of too good to be true, that, like, you know, a little town can just print its own money and people are going to have faith in that and take it seriously. But at the same time, it also seems like a really interesting idea, because you've got differences in cost of living in different parts of a country. And so you might have a national basic income and then local basic incomes to kind of top that up. And third thing I'll just mention quickly is, once I was lucky enough in Ecuador to corner Steve Keen, the Australian economist who talks about this stuff, for breakfast when he was visiting the country, which was a fascinating talk. And we ended up talking about this experiment, and he, you know, more or less seemed to say, well, maybe if this experiment hadn't been shut down, we wouldn't have got Hitler. So it'd be interesting to see what someone mentioned, what were the motives of the central government to shut this down. Maybe we can talk about the consequences when it got shut down as well, and what would have happened if, in fact, these experiments had sort of multiplied across, you know, Germany and Austria and these affected regions.
Yeah, good stuff. Let's go to Mitchell, Fred, and then Eddie.
I'm wondering how they came up with the percent and for the depreciation and that, and people have different needs at different times, so there's a need to save because everything costs different. Like a house you need to save for. So I'd just like that more elaborated later on in the discussion. That's all I have.
Yeah, it's a great question. Why 1%? My sense is that it was a fairly arbitrary decision. It could have been 2% and probably worked also, to the extent that it worked. Let's go to Fred and then Eddie.
I'm just going to listen. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Eddie, go ahead. You there, Eddie?
Yeah, I'm here. So yeah, I thought it was a really great article, and I'm really glad we're doing a thing on this one. A lot of you, I'm sure, have read my article, and I think this is very much related to that. The Great Depression, a lot of people are aware of Keynes's paradox of thrift, but I think a lot of people have a misconception about it, that it is like a psychological thing, that it's only a psychological thing, and that when everybody is scared to spend money, then the economy goes down. But I think that additionally, there's also a structural part of it which doesn't go away if everybody just becomes kind of more less scared tomorrow, which is that you know, prior to the Great Depression, you were seeing very high levels of wealth inequality. And so, you know, normal people, normal consumers, they were already spending all of the money that they had. They did not have any extra income. And so it was very important, really, just to get money into people's hands. And I think it works very well, even if the money is a local currency or and not necessarily the central currency. I'm actually curious to learn more about why the central bank felt the need to shut down that local currency, because I think it's very sad that they did that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Richard, go ahead.
Actually, what Austin was saying with might not have gotten Hitler would probably have occurred, because many Germans thought that Germany could have won the World War I, and that the Kaiser was just weak and they and gave up too early. And then the reparations for the Allies caused the Weimar Republic just to keep printing more and more money, and the German mark just became, well, worthless. You had to carry a whole royal barrel full just to buy a loaf of bread or an apple or something. And so the reason why the central bank eliminated canceled the experiment is because 200 other towns and whatnot wanted to start their own stamp currencies. And if 200 towns with however many thousands of people do it, that becomes a threat to the actual Austrian shilling, and it could overthrow it.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like as good of a reason as any. And I think it kind of speaks to the idea that if the central bank isn't managing the currency properly, or if you don't, if it's not properly facilitating spending in the economy, then you start to see alternatives pop up. And in this case, instead of learning from, learning that, oh, well, wait a minute, if we get people to spend more, maybe that helps our economy, get back on its feet. Or maybe they did learn that lesson, but in the process, they ended up shutting down all the alternatives because they wanted to kind of like be able to continue to manage their currency. If everyone's doing, if everyone has this currency in all their towns that circulates really fast, but then can't move between towns and stuff like that, you get all kinds of weird stuff going on in your economy. So I think, like, it would have been surprising if they hadn't shut it down, and it would have been really interesting to see if it evolved, or if they tried to like merge the different various local currencies of the towns or something like that. That would have been fascinating. Sarai, did you have a comment, or are you all set?
It was kind of answered, but yeah, I guess it's just like where, like if the same situation happens, so now we start having this currency, like say all throughout Boston, now you guys are just stuck with these stamps that like hold no value, and then again you were pushing people to spend it, but then it's like, where does like planning come in with that? Because it's like, yeah, even though you have foods, like for example, you have food stamps, if you don't need to spend all of it, you don't spend all of it. It doesn't expire that month, but basically you're saying that this would expire essentially, or like, the value goes down. So then you're going to want to spend it all that month. But then now it's like, again, it just feels consumption. I get it. Like now I'm hearing you say this, it's not, UBI isn't supposed to be a, to solve poverty, but then I don't know. I don't necessarily see it. If that's not the point, kind of like what Joan was saying, like if that's not the point, then like, yeah, you want to fix the economy, but why this model as opposed to other models? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's, UBI does solve poverty. That's what it does. And I would say that poverty is one of the things that happens if your economy is not functioning correctly. So the way in which UBI solves poverty is it gets the economy working, because the economy is already a giant anti-poverty machine. It's a giant welfare program, even if you think about it. And if the economy is not, providing for people's welfare, then there's something that kind of needs to be repaired. And the thing that's broken is that we don't have an efficient mechanism to get spending money into people's hands. So the point of UBI is it isn't just to solve poverty, it's to fix the economy. And one of the things that a broken economy causes is poverty. So it does end poverty. It's just that's not, you know, some people talk about that as being the objective of basic income. But then when you think about it only in that way, I think it starts, the perspective is a little bit narrower, and you don't understand maybe, or you're not talking about or seeing the broader implications of the fact that we're missing this fundamental piece of the economy. So it's like a fundamental piece of the economy that we're missing, and it causes poverty. And not only does it cause poverty, but it causes recessions, right? It causes, you know, the financial crash of 2008. It causes all of these different things if you don't have basic income. But in terms of the Wörgl experiment and their labor certificates, they really kind of like, they were focused on creating employment, getting people jobs, just increasing the spending. Because one of the biggest things that was happening during the Great Depression was that people weren't spending their money, and we still had all these resources to provide for people, but those resources weren't being activated, and then people ended up being poor because the way in which you get people money, or traditionally the way in which we get people money, is through jobs, through the labor market. And if people aren't being hired, then they end up being poor. Obviously, this is not an issue with basic income. With basic income, you know, you're not expected to get your money through jobs, and you're getting your money through the basic income, and the jobs are more kind of like, the wages are extra on top of the basic income. But you know, like they weren't thinking about basic income back then. Brian on the live stream said some of us want to solve poverty, and I think that's right. I think we all want to solve poverty, and this does that. It's just not it's not only for that. Yeah. So does anyone have, or do you have any more thoughts on that, Soraya, or does anyone else have any thoughts before we get to the article and start looking at the quotes? Oh, and one more comment about planning. Okay, we'll call on Bethany in a second. One more comment about planning is that, you know, if you have this currency that's expiring at the end of every month, or if you have this currency where you have to pay this payment at the end of every month, then if you want to save money, you're not going to save using these labor certificates. You're going to find some other asset, some other instrument with which to save. One of the things you can do, and it talks about this in the article a little bit, is that you can pay your taxes with it, right? So that means by paying your taxes now, that means there's fewer taxes you have to pay later. So that, in a sense, is a way of saving, and then you don't pay the penalty. Also, you can buy other things. You can buy maybe other currencies, or just, you know, actual stuff, and hold on to the actual stuff that retains its value, that kind of thing. Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to basically repeat you, but I think it would be misinterpretation for somebody. Like, I think that it can sound like you're saying something you're not if you sort of underemphasize solving poverty, because obviously solving poverty is itself a huge goal that's extremely important to a lot of people, including you. And so, like, it's just that you think of basic income as doing even more than that. But doing that is a big part of what's important to you about basic income. So I just want to make sure that didn't get lost. You know, I know how it's important for you to like frame it in a slightly different way, but I didn't want that point to get lost, or to make it seem like you didn't think that was a big part of what it would achieve or what it was for, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, solving poverty is hugely important. And I view poverty as being caused by this defect in the economy. So we're repairing the defect, and the defect causes poverty. The defect causes all kinds of other problems in our economy, in our society. And, you know, poverty is a consequence of the economy being broken, and this fixes that. Yeah, Bethany?
I guess just to say about that too, it's like, rather than thinking of poverty as some kind of natural thing that then needs to be solved, you see it as like a symptom of a broken system. So not necessarily a natural part of how the economy is supposed to work. Like, oh, a lot of people I think, oh, the economy, you know, just a natural aspect of the economy is that some people are going to be poor, you know, and then we can sort of like try to patch that up afterwards. Whereas I think your view is like, no, like well, assuming we have enough resources in the world or whatever, then it shouldn't necessarily be a natural part that people are falling through, you know, or ending up poor in the way that they are. That's actually like a symptom of a system not working properly. So that, I think that's a kind of a different perspective that you have.
Yeah, I like that. Poverty is not normal. It's not, you know, a consequence of the economy running efficiently. right? It's not a consequence of markets operating efficiently. That doesn't cause poverty. What causes poverty is when these things are broken, when the economy is broken, when the markets aren't working efficiently because people don't have money to spend. So Soraya, go ahead.
So, okay, thank you, Bethany, for like kind of clarifying that, because because earlier you said like it's not to solve poverty, but then that is a aspect of it, but not the overall all-encompassing point. I understand that part. I guess okay. Again, I'm a social worker, so from a social perspective, saying something like this, like especially the way that you're framing it, at least to my opinion, and like other people I've had these conversations with, it doesn't sound right. Like coming off the tongue, it doesn't sound right to like say this is just to stimulate the economy. This is just to stimulate spending. This is just to ensure people have money in their pocket, and then they have to spend it by the end of the month. Because then it's like, okay, but if especially if you're coming at it from that perspective of saying, okay, this is supposed to kind of like not even equalize, but then kind of just like lift other people up, just make sure everyone can get their basics. Because if it's called basic income, at least my interpretation of that would be, again, like a roof over your head, food in your belly, clothes on your back, basics, But then if you're like, okay, I'm not saying everyone shouldn't get it, but like even in like all the articles, all the other discussions that have happened, again, it started with the lower class. It started with the people who were impoverished, and then it was always supposed to move up so that everyone had access. But so far, no system has brought it where it's been universal, for their place. And then even like in Wörgl, like, then it, fell apart, and then all the people like sued, the government, because they're like, hey, what am I supposed to do with all this? Just like you're saying. But I just feel like it needs to be worded different, kind of. I don't know, because like I'm hearing what you say and I'm trying to rationalize it the way that like if I were to talk to other people, how I would interpret it, how I would say it, to make them understand the points of it. But like from the way that you're saying it, it doesn't add up. And then again, if you're saying that it's not about getting people out of poverty, I understand what you're saying, Bethany. Yeah, no one should be in poverty. It's we shouldn't think of it as there's always going to be haves, have nots. But then it's like so there's what, like 18 of us here or something, 14 people. You give everyone had the money they already had. Everyone just got an extra $2,000. You said something about like, we're not supposed to have inflation with this. But then how does this not just zero out in the end? Because I'm like, if everyone started at zero, or everyone started at different numbers, now you just gave everyone an extra 2,000. Now it's just zero for everyone. Like, you know what I mean? So.
Yeah, so there was a lot there. I think it's first of all, it's not true that if you give rich people money, it's going to cause inflation, because rich people don't really, $2,000 isn't going to affect their spending very much. They'll probably just like oh, whatever, someone gave me $2,000, I don't care, right? So giving rich people money actually is not inflationary, because when rich people just hold on to money, it's as if that money doesn't exist. It's not moving through the economy, that kind of thing. So there's really no cost necessarily to giving rich people money. But if you wanted to, you could still take away money from them. The main reason why basic income goes to everyone equally is that the people who need money the most are the ones who are least equipped to prove that they're not billionaires, right? The people with the least money are the ones who don't have the resources to show that they're the ones with the least money. They're just, they're poor. They can't, so instead of putting the burden on them, we just give everyone money equally. And then if we want to do things on the taxation side, we can. And you're right, we don't want inflation. Inflation is bad, but you can do this. You can do this without inflation. Yeah.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
So I guess I'm not seeing inflation in terms of like, well, kind of, yeah, I understand inflation would mean like the value of the dollar goes down, like, but what's to control the cost of goods now not costing more? How is it that you're going to control that housing prices don't go up? Because again, if you just gave everyone an extra $2,000, why aren't the landlords just going to charge more? Why aren't the farmers going to charge more? Like, yeah, I'm not saying that all these rich people are going to do whatever, but all the middle class people who want to move up, you know what I mean? It's just like, again, because this isn't necessarily a social issue, like the way that you're presenting it. So therefore, people are still good. If we're still in this capitalist society, people are still going to want to get the most out of it for themselves instead of thinking about everyone. So I think that part is missing, at least from my understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say the entire economy is a social issue. But I think Austin has a comment, so let's go to Austin.
Sorry, I was talking for a second then without unmuting. I actually think Soray's got a point. I have gone back and forth with Derek about this a lot in the Discord recently, about whether giving money to rich people, what effect that has, right? So I think you're right for the very rich, for, you know, the Jeff Bezos of the world. He's not going to notice another $2,000. It's not going to affect his behavior. But there are people near the threshold who might be thinking, will I or will I not buy a second home? That's the, you know, a really pressing real world example is you got a lot of sort of upper middle class people with 2 homes and a lot of poor people with none. And for the poor person who's trying to get their first home, having a middle class person buying a second home makes that harder because there's more competition, right? So that I think that there is more of a reason to, as you say, tax it back. That's how I think you deal with that problem. So you even though you don't have to tax for the UBI to fund it, you tax it to prevent the inflationary thing. But on the other hand, I also want to say you sort of raced past this idea that inflation is bad. I think that's a less obvious point than people sort of treat it as, right? There are times where you want inflation. So for example, using the housing market again, because it's such an important one that we all know a bit about, if housing prices drop dramatically and all of a sudden everyone owes the bank more money than their house is worth, like, or a lot of people have borrowed more than the house is worth, one way to, if you then inflate the currency, you can actually solve that problem because the dollar value that you owe the bank drops in real world purchasing power till again, once again, you're ahead, right? You erode away debts when inflation shrinks debt as well as shrinking savings. And most people, I think, I don't know what the odds are, but I definitely have more debt than I have savings. And that's the case for a lot of ordinary people in the real economy. You don't have savings, you got debt. So you want to shrink it down. So yes, I think a UBI can, the money that goes to wealthy people matters. And that the money, and that I think inflation is not so obvious. Just 2 little notes I scribbled down as we were racing through there.
Okay, yeah, and I think these are reasonable points, and this is more to the argument of to what extent should we be taxing rich people, that kind of thing. You know, the basic income itself on the payout side, if that goes to everyone, that's just more efficient, and it means no poor people are going to be not getting the money they need. So there's kind of this separate discussion where we can have where, well, how much should we tax rich people? Should we take away their basic income entirely? Should we take away their basic income and more? Right. So there's a lot of different possibilities on that dimension. And I have thoughts about that too, but that's different from just the discussion of basic income itself. I want to get to, so there's a couple comments on the live stream. Jay Gannon says, was poverty a part of tribal life? And I'm going to say, generally speaking, no. I think if a tribe came upon, you know, like a bad season or, you know, the entire, you know, there was resource scarcity or something like that, the whole tribe would probably suffer at the same time. It wasn't like you'd have this kind of poverty among plenty, which, you know, Henry George complains about and a lot of people complain about. And then Brian says, I hope that if the US is able to demonstrate its effectiveness, it can be partly used to address other problems like refugee crises by giving them cash to create a marketplace for their needs, that kind of thing. Yeah, that's absolutely right. You know, like, you know, if we care about all people, then, you know, you would want all people to be able to benefit from what the economy provides. So let's go to Richard.
This actually sort of reminds me of the company Scrit, where the company had a company store and you can only spend your wage like stamp money at the store. And so whatever price they set at the store, they had to pay that. There also reminds me of like sharecropping, which was actually a lot like the company Scrit, in that you had to, they just found ways to make you pay a certain amount, or ways to go into debt, and you had to pay to work on the farm, and they decided how much your cotton or your peanuts or whatever are worth. And then you would be in perpetual debt. And the debt was like the demurrage in the system.
Yeah, and sorry, I had a comment in the chat about the tribes. She's pointing out that in tribes, everyone works for the community, and if someone isn't pulling their weight, they're exiled or killed. And I think that's true to some extent, but I think it's also true that tribes would carry members that were no longer necessarily productive for them, like older people or disabled people. That can happen too. There was also instances of murdering babies that were weak and that kind of thing, so that also happened. So there's kind of like a whole range of possibilities there, but the overall point is true that generally speaking, if you have a smaller tribe, you're gonna need more people to contribute. Interestingly, in these kind of small scale tribal societies, people had a lot more leisure time. So even though everyone was contributing, generally speaking, they had a lot more time to kind of just hang out and tell stories and play around and stuff like that. So they were working far less than people today are, by and large. Let's go to Bethany.
Oh, I just wanted to clarify one point that is related to the discussion of this experiment versus basic income. So like the Wörgl experiment is trying to manipulate people's spending in a particular way by getting them to spend more quickly with the demurrage at the end of the month. But generally basic income isn't proposed that way. Like it's not trying to make you spend by a certain time frame or anything like that. It's just money that you get, in that sense, similar to an income from a job. They're usually, as so far as I know, most plans don't have like special conditions or incentives to make you spend faster or anything like that. So that might be something to talk about in terms of the comparison between the two.
Yeah, I think that's an important difference. In the Wörgl experiment, the government is still spending kind of this limited amount of money, and they're trying to get it to circulate faster. Maybe it comes back to them through taxes, that kind of thing. But they really want to get people to spend more. We're not trying to do that with basic income. With basic income, you're just giving people access to the economy, and they can use that access if they want to buy goods and services, that they may want and need. That the things that make them not poor, the things that make them better off, right? It's fine if they choose not to do that. That's not a problem at all. So it's a little bit of a different goal with the Wörgl experiment. With basic income, for sure, if people aren't spending very much money, that means you can give them more basic income if you want to, because the economy has room for that. So it's thinking about it from a little bit of a different perspective. Mom, go ahead.
Yeah, to that point, the goal may not be to get people to spend into the economy more, but there would be a goal with basic income now. It would be a different goal, but there still would be a goal, and it does have more to do with what we're talking about earlier, which is solving poverty, or at least in terms of like the pandemic. They're starting to think about, well, people need subsistence. They're not working, so they do need some kind of income. That's a different goal for basic income than spending into the economy. But I think you're saying that also happens as a result of basic income, although that would not necessarily be the main goal now. The other point was about the tribes and that they would be exiled or someone exiled or killed if they weren't pulling their weight. Well, we do have the equivalent, which is you get exiled to poverty and homelessness if you're not pulling your weight. So it's not that different. And the weak, the elderly. I mean, right now the elderly are at risk because we're opening the economy and people are getting reinfected and stuff. But as Trump says, some people have to go. There have to be sacrifices. So there are sacrifices, and they are the weaker people of the tribe. In our case, yeah.
Yeah, I think the tragedy is that we don't actually need people to kind of pull their weight, right? And we tend to keep people employed less because we need their contribution, but because we were using that as a way to get them money. And that's kind of what we ultimately need. We, you know, during the pandemic, we need people to stay home and not work as much as possible unless they're essential workers. But we also want everyone to be able to access what the economy can still provide for them, so they don't starve, so they're not poor, so they don't, you know, try to go get a job when now's not the best time to be out there working. Yeah.
Totally.
Let's go to Eddie. Go ahead, Eddie.
So, sorry, I brought up the point a bit back about inflation, and that's a very common idea. This worry that, you know, if we give everybody money through a UBI, that this will cause an inflation. And I want to point out that, you know, going back the last 10 years, the Federal Reserve, the central bank, has actually been very worried about deflation, and in order to prevent deflation, the opposite of inflation, we are actually giving, you know, trillions and trillions of dollars to wealthy people and to corporations through the debt markets to prevent deflation, to make sure that we have enough inflation. And so if we were to give people money through UBI, it would be very easy. In fact, it would be pretty much automatic that the Federal Reserve, the central bank, would actually stop having to give trillions of dollars to wealthy people and corporations to make sure that we don't have deflation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's exactly right. I mean, the way we prevent deflation now, or the way we keep prices stable now, is that we pump money into Wall Street. We pump money into the financial sector. And the people who benefit the most from that are the rich people. And a little bit of money leaks out through jobs and stuff to ordinary consumers. But this is a really inefficient way to push money to ordinary people. So I think that's a really good point, Eddie. Eddie, did you have more to say, Eddie?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
Thanks, Alex.
Put your hand down when you're done. Or actually a couple comments on the live stream, or one comment on the live stream. So David says, could you give out decaying money in digital currency? That would be kind of cool. So yeah, you could. So in Wörgl, you know, everybody had to get a stamp at the end of the month. With digital currency, you could do the same thing, except at the end of the month, you know, the purchasing power of the currency decreases by 1% automatically. And instead of having a $1 bill, you have a 99-cent bill, but it wouldn't be a bill. It would be, you know, just that's the amount of money you have. Or you wouldn't even have to do it, you know, at the end of the month. It could be like a continuous thing, like the money is constantly depreciating, right? So then you're getting like, it's kind of a continuous negative interest rate. And the question we can ask is, would that be useful? Would that be good for the economy? And I think part of that question is, well, how do you establish that as your currency? So the way they did it in Wörgl was to have it backed 100% by Austrian shillings. Would you have to do that with the digital currency as well? Because if you think about it, these labor certificates in Wörgl, they're not really a different currency. They're still Austrian shillings. They're denominated in Austrian shillings. It's the same kind of base currency. It's still the Austrian shilling, and they're creating an instrument that is denominated in this currency. So would you have to do that as well? And my sense is that if you need these kinds of tricks and gimmicks to get people to spend money, maybe you can do that. It's going to be a little bit trickier if you're not in a situation like Wörgl, where people can actually say, "Hey, you know, I want to trade my digital labor certificates for real money right away." If that gets a lot easier, then it gets a lot harder to maintain the incentive effects of the kind of depreciating currency, and it gets a lot harder, or not depreciating, but the, you know, demurrage currency, and it gets a lot harder to maintain the value of that demurrage currency if nobody wants to hold it, nobody wants to use it, and it's just as easy to transfer real money, like actual money that doesn't have demurrage associated with it. So part of me wonders if some of the benefits that they got at that time were specific to the situation that they were in, where people didn't have access to real money, that kind of thing. Go ahead, Bethany.
Oh yeah, I mean, I guess I was just interested in this question, kind of digging more into the comparison with Wörgl that you asked of when would it be useful to have a depreciating currency? And initially I was thinking pretty skeptically about it, but I guess one thing that you brought up or someone brought up about the Great Depression is that there was almost a psychology of fear that needed to be overcome. So it wasn't that people didn't have good reasons to spend their money, but they were so afraid that things would get even worse that they were just really reluctant. So it was sort of a special circumstance. And I guess I could see under circumstances like that, where the fear is kind of creating like a downward spiral, that you would want to add maybe some extra incentive to spend if you couldn't counteract that fear with other measures that made things seem more stable. So I suppose like a basic income that you knew you were going to keep getting could do that. But if things are so bad, you might not even trust that will see, keep happening. So I guess I'm a little more open to it, even though under normal times it seems strange to try to incentivize people to spend more than they want to. I can imagine these particular situations with kind of fear dominating being situations where you would want that. And I guess that's what they were thinking about.
Yeah, but if you imagine a situation with a basic income and everybody's afraid to spend, but also nobody's poor because they do have money and they can spend if they want to, maybe not the end of the world. Yeah, so it's you obviously you probably don't want deflation. There are ways to prevent that without getting people to spend more money necessarily. You can use taxes to create the inflationary pressure that you need. That kind of thing. And then there's the question of, would it even work? So this is kind of like what we're getting at with the digital currency version of it. If it's really, really easy for people to convert to assets that don't, come with this penalty, then they're just going to do that. They're not going to spend more money. They're just going to immediately convert their labor certificates to something that's not going to have a penalty associated with it. So
Yeah,
it doesn't actually boost spending anymore.
You'd have to deal with that, right, in some way.
Some way, yeah. Go ahead, Austin.
I was just thinking of something you said then, as you talked about, even if people aren't spending, at least they're not poor. And I think that's a point that's more about basic income generally than this particular this particular local currency experiment. But this is something that occurs to me a lot, is that people talk about and with comparison with the federal jobs guarantee, which is the better sort of automatic stabilizer. And I think that maybe what gets left out of that discussion is, well, to an extent, if everyone's still okay, if people aren't becoming homeless or children aren't missing meals, who cares what's happening with the macro economy, right? It becomes it's at the moment when the economy crashes, it means a huge amount of immediate human suffering. Whereas with a universal basic income, individual and household well-being is it's dislocated, it's decoupled from the macroeconomic situation to a certain extent. And I think that's something that just doesn't, gets undersold.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And not just the financial sector collapsing, but say, we get hit with a pandemic, right? There's no reason why coronavirus should be making anybody poor. And it's all a consequence of kind of this machinery that we've set up in the economy where people get their income through jobs, et cetera, et cetera. Did you have more to say, Austin?
Yeah, just follow up. It's like there's exogenous shocks like this where it comes from the outside. A meteor hits the earth or whatever. There's a war. There's whatever reason the economy has to contract. Spending power has to contract. As long as there's a floor for that, where that spending power doesn't drop below, that provides a lot of preventative pressure. But also, there's a theory on, the sort of right-wing libertarian pro-market side that you want these cyclical crises in the market because they kill bad businesses. And I'm actually somewhat sympathetic to that, that there's a lot of businesses out there that maybe aren't that profitable, that don't have a great idea, that aren't necessarily the best use of the resources and the people's talent. And maybe we want that game to be a little bit more dangerous in terms of, if you're trying to run a business, you got to be shit hot and you got to be doing something that really matters and is really worthwhile. And so maybe we do want these cyclical crises to an extent, as long as we can protect people from, the humanitarian consequences of them. That's all.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the cyclical crises do weed out the bad businesses. But I also think it's true that if you have a high enough basic income, and that allows monetary policy to be tighter, those businesses are not going to be able to get going in the first place. So instead of weeding them out, maybe the basic income is spraying the lawn with like anti-weed, Roundup or something like that. I don't know, right? To kind of continue the analogy. But yeah, so I'm not convinced that the cycles of financial crises are a good thing. I think they do have that effect of clearing out the bad stuff from the economy. But another way to clear out the bad stuff from the economy is just not to have it in the first place. And I think we can achieve that. Soraya, go ahead.
All right. So legit, this is such a good conversation. I'm so happy to be a part of this. So I was reading your article that you had sent the link about universal basic income fixes the housing market. So I was kind of skeptical, and then I had to read it like 2-3 times, and I was like, oh, okay. So my question now is, okay, can we kind of move into how will we implement this? Like, is it starting tomorrow, everyone just gets this money? Because like, okay, so like from the article, if anyone else hasn't read it, basically they're saying, instead of us thinking about changing the economy from the supply aspect, so let's give more supply, let's change it from the demand aspect. So now put the consumer more in control rather than the person who's giving, like, making the products or the goods. So I'm so on board with that, because yeah, I think that stuff is overpriced for no reason. It's like the same house square footage, whatever that you would buy in Ohio is different than Boston, or in Columbus than Boston, but the material costs the same, the workers are getting paid the same amount, but yet this person in Boston is going to make a much bigger profit for, making that house and selling it rather than the person in Ohio. Why? So it gives me, 2 things. So one, how do we calculate this basic income to make sure that it's equitable across like the entire US, because there are varying, economic situations for everyone, or like cost of living, is different for everyone depending on where they live. And then, yeah, how do we, like, is this going to be like in stages? Is it just boom, everyone just gets, $2,000 per se, or like, what is the practice, or yeah, what is your plan to implement this, to roll this out, or anyone's thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I think Derek is gonna respond to your question. Go ahead, Derek.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, just what comes to mind when people talk about making sure we can calculate the basic income to make sure that it's equitable. What I think of is that what's cool about basic income is that it is equitable by default. I like to say that basic income is income equality, in the sense that every single member of the whole country gets the same amount, as opposed to wages, wages and profits are inherently unequal. Some businesses are successful, some are not. Some people get paid a lot, some don't, and they vary all over the place. And there's this big concern to kind of, can we make them more equal? The cool thing about basic income is that it's already equal by definition. And then what we can do is simply by raising it, right? That kind of, you can try to raise the basic income as high as possible, and it remains equal for everyone. So that's how I look at that problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So as you increase the basic income, that shrinks the part of the economy that's unequal. So it means we don't need to do as much of this stuff through the financial sector and the labor market and that kind of thing. So to the extent that there's room to increase the basic income, you're increasing kind of equality of income, or you're providing something where everyone kind of gets the same. So if you have basic income at kind of the maximum level the economy can sustain, then that means that you're only ever really hiring people, or you're only keeping the basic income lower than raising it any further. The only reason you're doing that is because you actually need to provide an incentive for people to contribute work, or to kind of pull their weight or something. You don't need everyone to be pulling their weight, but you need enough people to be pulling enough weight to produce the things for everybody. And so you reward them a little bit, and that means that the basic income can't go as high as it would if everybody likes doing all the work for free or something like that. Go ahead, Derek. No, Derek's good. Go ahead, Soraya.
Okay, so yeah, like what would that incentive be? Because it's not like, it's not just you got basic income and now you gotta, pay taxes, because that's not really gonna encourage people to take, why am I gonna take like a harder job when like I can just go take whatever menial job there is to make like an extra 10 cents? But then also it's making me think, because again, if this is, so two questions, sorry. If this currency is just supposed to be used micro, like, in our nation, now is this gonna, do you think this more goods or services are gonna become privatized? Because, just like there's government housing, that's bare minimum, whatever. But then I'm like, if you want something more, you wanna choose, you gotta go private, as of right now. And then with implementing something like this, would this make the quality of like government goods or things such as like schools, you know what I mean? Because right now schools are based off of taxes, based off of income of people, like depending on where they live. So now if you have people who are just like, I can make 3,000 for sitting down instead of, going to deal with those snot-nosed kids, now we're losing quality teachers, now we're losing quality social services. So again, more so from a social perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Yeah, so two questions on the incentive side. What incentivizes people? I think that sort of reveals what wages and profits really should be for. They shouldn't be thought of as income streams primarily. The way we look at them today, we think about worker incomes and wanting to raise them. Those are the incentive tools. They're a little bit of a cherry on top. They're a bonus that we offer to people to get them to get off the couch of the basic income and go do something else. And as long as that basic income level is calibrated correctly, you can think of it as you're trying to find the most amount of basic income that still allows wages to remain effective as a way to motivate people to do all these different things that we need. And on the question of government services and products and that sort of thing, how I look at it is this: like, we sort of know intuitively that there are some things that the market's good at providing, like fast food restaurants and grocery stores, things like this. And there's other things that we know we definitely need the state for, like healthcare and defense in some people's view, that sort of thing. And so I think that what basic income, Alex likes to say that basic income funds the market. So basically it makes sure that everybody can get the most benefit possible from the private sector, from the market. Now that might mean that there's some things we're providing today that people can just get from the market then, but that doesn't necessarily, you can look at that as it's sort of taking over the state's job. But another way to look at that is that you're actually, you're freeing the state's time and attention and resources for more things that the market can't do. So if we need less food stamps because people have better access to food, that program can then be transitioned into something cool and interesting that the market just wasn't doing, like a national arts program or a space program or something like that. There's more things the state can be doing if the market is operating to the best possible extent.
Yeah, I think that's right. Austin, go ahead.
So I think we also kind of raised past the implementation question a little while ago. And I think something that's interesting about right now is that it changes that. So normally in good times, quote unquote, when things are working as well as they normally do, right? We would say, well, you introduce it slowly. So you start out with, $10 a month and then $20 a month, and you sort of see what's happening. And this is what Alex likes to say, you feel your way towards the ideal amount, right? I think at the moment though, because the economy is dropping through the floor, you might actually want to move faster than that and drop it in quite quickly, right? Like, so start out at a higher amount and ramp it up faster than you would in normal times. But the other thing was about what about the government's quality of government services provide? And there's kind of two parts to that. One is the political context in which the thing is introduced. So you get these people on the left who say, no, the UBI is a libertarian Trojan horse. They're going to bring that in, and then they're going to take away, all the other, all government healthcare and government stuff. And there are people on the right who advocate that. They say, we'll just give you universal basic income, but apart from that, you're on your own. But one of my things that I've always responded is like, well, if you let them do it, then that's what's going to happen. Because the UBI is a good idea, and if the right is the only people advocating it, then they're going to get to do their version of it, when they implement it. But what we're actually seeing at the moment, again, is that it's not the right who are advocating universal basic income. It's Ilhan Omar, it's Bernie Sanders, it's Rashida Tlaib. It's the most progressive politicians in the US system that are advocating for universal basic income. In Scotland, it's Nicola Sturgeon, who's quite left wing. The people who are advocating it now are exactly the same people who are also going to advocate expanded public housing and better quality public housing and all of those things. So that's the kind of, it can go either way question, depends on who's doing it. But regarding, getting, will we lose public teachers? If they're getting, 3,000 is a high basic income to stay at home, that's still, just a little under 40,000 a year. If they can make another $60,000 a year in the public sector, bringing the total income up to 100,000, then that's a pretty strong incentive. So my response to that would be pay teachers and pay public teachers more, pay them a lot more, right? Which we should be doing anyhow. And this might force us to do that. But again, it all depends on it being implemented by people who have progressive values generally, not being implemented by sort of techno-libertarians who say, it's going to be fine. We're going to give everyone this sort of drip feed of, $1,000 a month. And apart from that, you're on your own. So it's a good idea that could be used for negative purposes, but that's why we should, the left and people who believe in the provision of public services should take ownership of it and steer it.
Yeah, I think that's true. That basic income on its own is this fantastic thing. It gives people money so they can buy things. That's great. But then there are people who try to associate basic income with other policies, like maybe cutting healthcare or cutting education or something like that. That's not what basic income is. Basic income is just giving money to people so they can buy things. It can be spun in a lot of different ways politically and kind of associated with other plans politically. Ideally, we would want it not to be associated with things that would be harmful for people when you kind of put it into the political context. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
I guess this might change gears a little bit, but I'm curious to see what we learned from the experiment in Wörgl about like what people ended up spending it on. And I was particularly intrigued by people talking about how people had pooled their resources to do public projects, which maybe works on a small scale. Like usually I think of that as something separate from what a basic income would be for, which is more something that the government would do. But I guess I'm just curious if we could get into like some of the details about what they did. It might be kind of interesting.
Yeah. So my sense is that they just spent money in the normal way on kind of like the normal things that you would spend your paycheck on. It's just that they didn't, they were unemployed before. But then this ended up, creating jobs for more people, because when more people had more money to spend, that caused more labor to be hired. So people's incomes were increased throughout the economy, even if they weren't working in public sector jobs. And at the same time, everybody's paying their taxes. They're paying their labor certificates back to the government because they don't want to hold on to them. So sometimes they'd even be paying their taxes early as a way to avoid the penalty, that kind of thing. This gives the government more money to spend. So the labor certificates cycle back to the government. The government spends more money. So I don't think it was the case necessarily that people just got together and pooled their resources out of their own volition, but the government now has more funding because the money is streaming back into the government because everyone's paying extra taxes, right? So then the government pays for the ski jump or the bridges or whatever kind of infrastructure, whatever they want to do. It enables more government spending because they're constraining themselves in this way, and they kind of have to maintain the value of these labor certificates.
Yeah. And I guess then I'll just say a follow-up to that, which is in a way that connects that experiment in Wörgl to this question about inflation people have, because one way you can give people more money without inflation is, as you said, you're actually substituting private financial money for a different kind of money, for just government issued money. But another way is that you have productive capacity that's untapped that needs to get tapped. Or that can get tapped. And it seems like that's what you're describing happening. Obviously, during the Great Depression, we definitely had that, right? Like we had tons of capacity that just wasn't being used because everything was spiraling downward. And so there, what you really want is to just add more money, and it won't cause inflation. It'll cause good things, like things to happen that people want to do, production to happen or that kind of thing. So I guess maybe we could talk about how the experiment relates to that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's exactly what it did, is it activated resources that were sitting idle. And on its own, resources sitting idle, that which includes labor, people not having to work, it's fine. Not having to use up natural resources is fine. But if there are resources that are sitting idle and people need the benefit that activating those resources would provide, then you've got a problem. So the extra spending in the Wörgl economy activated those idle resources, and this was kind of a problem throughout, the Great Depression throughout the world. In the 1930s, we had more capacity to produce more goods and services for people, including the basic stuff like food and all of that. But people had less money to buy it, and people weren't being hired to produce it as a result, which meant people had even less money. So you had all these resources sitting idle. Labor was one of them, but other resources, factories, all kinds of stuff was not activated, and that was kind of the problem of the Great Depression. And I think the Wörgl Experiment, or their program, kind of addressed that without kind of breaking the assumptions or kind of the structure of the economy where people are expected to get their incomes through jobs. If they've been able to pay out a basic income, or if they had decided, or if they'd found a way to pay a basic income and decided to do that, you're allowing consumers to activate the capacity, but you're not forcing the capacity to be activated in order for people to become consumers. So what they did was they forced labor to be activated. That was what pushed money to people and allowed them to consume. So they're kind of like, they're doing it at a different part of the system. And I think if you want to maximize the benefit for people, you want to start at the level of the consumer, and then only the resources that are necessary will get activated. So the Wörgl way of doing it is maybe less than optimal, but better than nothing, is kind of how I would frame it. Derek, go ahead.
I think I just raised it. I think there's other people with hands up before too.
Go ahead, Austin.
What I'm saying actually really follows on from what you and Bethany were just talking about, because it's really focusing on the local currency side of stuff. One thing that it occurs to me is that this doesn't just increase the supply of this new currency, it can actually end up meaning to more of the national currency coming in. So if I use my local currency to pay a dude and he builds me a house, I can then use that to borrow against, or I can sell it and get real money for that asset that's now being created using real money, right? Using national money rather than local money. I can use local money to build it, then get national money with the asset once it's created, because it's not, once you mobilize resources, you actually increase local capacity. The local government uses it to make a canning factory, right? And then you sell those cans of food into the national economy for national dollars as well. So it's not just like you sort of go down the rabbit hole of your own and decouple from the national economy, and you have your own little economy and your own little currency over here, because it actually mobilizes real world resources that can then be used to sort of plug back into the national or broader economy as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm worried. I think there actually is a little bit of a rabbit hole effect as well, because if you are a business, or even the city of Wörgl, right? You're accepting shillings as tax payments, but you're also accepting these shilling-denominated labor certificates as tax payments. If I'm a taxpayer and I need to pay my taxes, which currency am I going to use to pay my taxes? If I've got some regular shillings, then I've got shilling labor certificates, I'm going to get rid of the labor certificates, because those are the ones I don't want to hold on to. Those are the ones that I have to pay the penalty on. So you can imagine that if this program had kept going on for a really long time, the government of the city of Wörgl would maybe not be getting many shillings in through their tax payments, because it would be mainly just cycling back of these labor certificates. So that can end up being a problem if they wanted to expand the amount of labor certificates. They would need more. They would need more shillings in their reserves if they're going to keep the one-to-one backing, that kind of thing. So there's lots of interesting things there. But I think you're right that by producing more stuff, by adding more productive capacity to the economy, you're pulling more money in from outside. I think the concern is just that once that money is pulled in, people just hold on to it because they get rid of their labor certificates first. So this is kind of Gresham's law thing. If there's two currencies circulating that have different values to people, like one is worth more to people and one is worth less, but there are certain institutions or businesses that accept payment at equal levels. When you go to one of those businesses, or if it's the government, when you go to make a payment, you're going to pay in the currency that's worth less to you, and you're going to hold on to the one that's more valuable. So people are going to keep spending the labor certificates, which is kind of what the labor certificates are designed for. But if there's an option of also having regular Austrian shillings in there, now the shillings are kind of suppressed, or they're forced out by the labor certificates, which become the real currency of circulation in the city.
Just really quickly, I'll just add that this is actually the problem that all non-US governments face as well with their currencies, right? Like, because everyone's doing international trade in the US dollar. So it's not like this is a new dynamic that we have no experience with. Lots of countries already have basically a dual currency, because people will, a lot of places you can still spend US dollars, and people would prefer purchases made in US dollars over local currency sometimes. So it's the same dynamic at play with a small national currency.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit different when the currencies are allowed to float relative to each other, right? So you might be in a country where some businesses accept dollars and then they accept another currency and the price is different, right? So I'm talking about more like the price is the same. So the price, if you want to pay your taxes, you pay the same amount of shilling labor certificates as you would actual shillings. So the prices are kind of being kept fixed relative to each other, and then it creates this effect of not just, like there's weird dynamics where in some contexts one currency is preferred or not. You create this effect of the actual circulating currency in the economy is the one that is overvalued, and then the undervalued one just kind of disappears. It's not even the economy's money anymore.
Yeah, but there are some countries that do that too. There are some countries that have the currency fixed. So it's, we still have a body of knowledge to draw on from their experiences. Yep,
exactly. And this has happened also in times and places where you have a currency pegged to a precious metal. In the 19th century, the United States had kind of like a bimetallic standard where there was a gold peg and a silver peg at the same time, and depending on the relative prices of gold or silver, one day everyone would be spending silver, and then the next day everyone would be spending gold, because the prices had to be were fixed in the economy. So you just have this crazy back and forth between, are we really on a gold standard or really on a silver standard, that kind of thing. So yeah, it can be a hard thing to kind of to keep two currencies of different value at the same value in specific contexts. Derek, go ahead.
These are all great discussion, great points. Yeah, it's like the impression I'm getting is that it's certainly workable. It's not really ideal from some people's perspective, but it's certainly, like, I'm looking at it, the more you guys are talking about it, I'm thinking of it as it's like a hack for a kind of budget constrained currency issue, or like a local government to artificially increase the circulation of the money. So I mean, instead of the money kind of just flowing through the economy and getting collected by more people, like collected as investments or in profits, something like that, there's a bit more of incentive for people to actually just spend it right and grab more stuff with it. So that's great if your local economy just is being punished by the higher economy and you don't have enough money to spend. And it kind of makes up for that problem. But it also actually, it's adding an extra incentive to spend, to consume, which actually kind of isn't what you want. We want people to have more money to be able to buy more stuff. We don't necessarily want to incentivize them to go out and spend more and circulate it more just for its own sake. Some of the things that people like to do with money is save it up and buy something else in the future. So yeah, I do think basic income is better, but this is a kind of interesting hack that a local government can do when it's to make its money more effective if the other people aren't playing ball with it.
Yeah, I like that. I like that you framed it as a hack, because I think there are, even in our economy, our modern economy today, a lot of the things we do with our economic policies are hacks to get around the fact that we don't have basic income. So we use economic policy to create jobs, because we need a mechanism to get spending money into the hands of consumers. That's a hack because we don't have basic income. We wouldn't be using the labor market as a tool for funneling money to consumers if we had an actual efficient way of getting money to consumers. And then same thing with overstimulating the financial markets, pouring money into Wall Street. That's kind of a hack that's compensating for this problem of lack of basic income and the problems that it causes, right? And you could say the same thing for a lot of the welfare programs and food stamps and stuff like that. Like if the economy is working correctly, people have money and they're going to be able to buy food. But if the economy is not working correctly and we know people need food, then we come up with these other ways to get people food, these kind of hacks. And we've kind of built all these different hacks on top of hacks to compensate for not having a basic income, not having an efficient mechanism to get spending money into consumers' hands. Did you have a follow-up, Derek?
I didn't, but just to echo on that a little bit, like, yeah, what's cool about this is it's really specifically to a hack of the money itself. It's like money that's put in a wrapper and they add a little notch on it, a little stamp, and that's kind of cool. It's not a big monetary system. It's just a very simple thing that a local independent government could do if it felt it needed to.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. If the greater government of your country is not doing economic policy correctly, what kinds of hacks can you have at the local level that compensate for that? And a lot of the hacks I was talking about were at the national level anyway, but this is kind of a local hack. Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah. So back to the experiment, I'm now trying to think, since they backed their new currency 1-to-1 with reserves, how were they able to do more spending than they would have done before? Like, I guess that's pretty essential to what we've been talking about. And I realize I don't quite understand how that worked.
Yeah, it's because the people wanted to get rid of the labor certificates, so they paid their taxes. Mm. So it increased the city's revenue.
So it was simply that Demurrage, where like it depreciated at the end of the month, that had the impact?
No. It created an incentive for them to pay their. I mean, that helps too. The total amount of currency outstanding is decreasing, or they have to pay the fee, and that provides revenue for the government. But it was more than that. It was that they wanted to spend their labor certificates, and one of the things you could spend it on was taxes. So people were paying more taxes straight up, not just the 1% fee, but in general they were paying more taxes.
Wait, why were they paying more than they were paying before?
Because they're trying to figure out ways to get rid of their labor certificates, and they know they have to pay their taxes eventually, so they just pay them early.
So it was just that they spent the money sooner that they would have spent anyway?
So that's part of it. And then also maybe there's, obligations to pay more taxes because there's more money circulating in the economy. So now there are more things to tax. So there's a higher level of taxation as well.
But I guess I'm not understanding, why are there more things circulating in the economy other than that little incentive to spend? It seems like it kind of comes down.
It's not a little incentive to spend. It's a big incentive to spend. People want to get rid of it. So they spend it. And then that spending keeps going, and you spend it once, and then the next guy spends it. It keeps going, right? Right. So that creates a lot more taxable activity in the economy.
I see. So but that's the root of it. Like, they otherwise could have spent exactly the same amount in the national currency because they had a reserve, but people wouldn't have had that incentive to spend it.
Yes, exactly. If the government had just spent instead of putting the shillings in reserve, if they just spent the shillings, then those, workers, those public sector workers would get their money and then hold on to it, and then you're done, right? So this is a way around that. It's a way to keep the money going in the economy.
Yeah. So I guess it's interesting because it's a totally different mechanism than basic income, where you're actually giving people money that you wouldn't have been able to give them, or you weren't giving them before. But then once it starts circulating, maybe some of those secondary effects are similar to what we might see with the basic income. We haven't talked as much about those these kind of secondary effects. But.
Yes, it's activating the economy just like a basic income would, or a basic income also activates the economy, but it's doing it through a slightly different mechanism. With basic income, you just say, oh, people aren't spending very much money. That means we could give them more money if we wanted to, and they could activate more of the economy. Whereas here, you're taking kind of this existing money and you're turning it into something that people really want to spend, and it just keeps getting spent repeatedly.
Yeah, I guess not to get too technical, but I think some people might be interested, or it reinforces for me the fact that it's not really about like it's not just about the amount of money that you have to spend, but it's about the velocity of that money, like how much it's circulating. That's really very important. And so here it's almost as if they have more money simply because they're getting the money to circulate in a different way.
Right. Whether you're doing it the Wörgl way or the basic income way, you're increasing the level of consumer spending. You're increasing that flow. And that can, you can think about that as there being more money out there, so people are spending more, or you can think about it as kind of like the same money, turning over faster, so they're spending more. Yep.
Yeah, so they're getting more out of that initial reserve that they use to back it up, simply because they get people to. So it's almost as if they have more reserves in terms of how people would usually try to think about the amount of money.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry to take up a lot of time, but I'm trying to think.
No, that's fine. Let's go to Soraya.
Girl, I always take up so much time. So, all right. So, kind of going back to Bethany, what the point you had made before, and then what Austin was talking about, thinking about how do how do we make sure that people don't just sit down, don't just I got the money and then stay home and don't give back to the society. So, I know like other countries, like you're required, we're required to register for the military, but like you don't actually have to like go serve, and like other countries do that. Like in Europe, a lot of countries went in order to graduate high school and then go to the public universities for free, they have to serve like 2 years of like volunteering or in the military, like so that could be like working in a hospital, just like working in the public sector. They don't they're most of them are usually living with their families, like they're not like Americans, like we're 18, we're adults, move out. So they're still kind of like with their families, but then they are able to access the public services, you know what I mean, because they gave back to society in that sense. So kind of like what you were saying, like, so Wörgl, what they were doing was putting more money in people's pockets to activate the resources. The resources were jobs at that point. We're saying there's so many jobs that we don't need, but there's still a lot of like social services and still a lot of local things that like need to happen. For example, there could be like some abandoned house, or there could be like kids that need to be tutored, or whatever. So now by giving this, like, do you think something like requiring every citizen, able-bodied or whatever, to volunteer for whatever it is, like 2 hours a month or 100 hours a year or something like that, kind of like you're in college, you have to volunteer, or you're like in a fraternity or sorority, you have to volunteer, you have to give back, you're already paying to be a part of this. We still pay taxes regardless if we get this UBI or not. We're already paying to be a part of this economy, to be a part of this society. So now, but we're saying in order to keep it flowing optimally, we want to make sure that this is a principle of like putting back into the society, like reinvesting untapped potential. That's what your words, Bethany. So it's like those untapped capacity would be the volunteering, and then it would further incentivize, just like you guys were saying, the progressive politicians who would say, okay, yes, everyone's able to access these basic things, but we need the quality of those basic things to remain high and not just become like sub anything. This is how my mind is working. Please share your thoughts with me. What you guys think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought. I think you don't need to have a rule that everyone has to volunteer a certain amount or contribute a certain amount. I think that's what money is for, and that's what the labor market is for. To get people to do things, we pay them. And that can be the government participating in the labor market and hiring people for things that need done, things that they need to be done. Or it can be individual people in the market wanting certain things to happen and then paying other people to do those things. That's what the labor market is for. And the idea with basic income is that instead of expecting the labor market to provide everyone with all their money, you're only using it as a way of getting people to do the necessary work in the economy. So you could even imagine, that if we're paying enough money to get people to do all the necessary work in the economy, there are some people who maybe aren't going to be working at all because they prefer to stay home and play video games or whatever, and that's totally fine. We didn't need that labor, so it's okay. That's what makes it okay. So some people might be working a lot because they really want the extra money, and then some people might be working not at all, and that's just how it works. That's more or it's kind of how it shakes out, and that's more efficient than saying everybody needs to contribute a certain amount. And if you say everybody needs to contribute a certain amount, then you're also forcing the people who really don't want to be there doing that work to do the work. One way to think about it is that basic income filters all the lazy workers out of the labor market. And we can call them lazy, and this is actually kind of what next week's topic is. Next week we're going to be talking about idleness and leisure and the role of that in our society. But if we want to think about what we need in the labor market, we want the workers who are the most productive and the most motivated. If you force people to work, to do work, then you're going to get the ones who are not competent or not interested in doing a good job, that kind of thing. Basic income can say, if you have a high enough basic income, you can say, okay, guys, go home. We don't need your contribution. You're not going to do a very good job anyway. And now the people who are going to do a good job don't have to be competing with those other workers who are just trying to get the job in order to survive, right? So I think that's one way to think about it. There, we don't need contributions from everyone. We just need the right amount of overall contribution.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. So for example, there's again 11 people here. All of you guys have to go to work. We're still going to get the same basic income. Alex, you have to become a public school teacher. You're only getting an extra 10 cents. Richard, you own these apartment complexes. Just for having the apartment complexes, you get your base money. It's like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to keep going with that analogy, but like what you said about the tribes. Yeah, like whoever asked the question on the Facebook thing about the tribes, like was there poverty in tribes? But no, like the group only survived because everyone looked out for the collective instead of the individual. So by providing a basic income, if people aren't now providing to society, you're just draining society. It's not going to keep going because there's going to be so many people who revolt against that or say, oh my gosh, like, just like people are afraid of, or not afraid of, people are upset about people who receive welfare. No one lives large off of welfare. No one lives large off of Social Security. You know what I mean? No one lives large off of disability. Like, yeah, we need those programs. But I guess what I'm saying is like, okay, yes, let's provide a basic income, but let's also make it just like how the Wörgl, they did it. They had an incentive for it. It wasn't just to spend. It wasn't just consumerism. It was about reinvigorating the economy, allowing people to not be stressed about, I need to save money because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You know what I mean? So now they're able to work. Yeah, we're saying there's so many jobs out there that are useless. People don't need to be there. However, there's many things that a robot's not going to be able to do. We need human interaction. So I'm saying, I don't know. I can't, me personally, I can't get on board with flat out everyone just gets, whatever amount of money and people can just sit down, because to me, I feel like that's going to lead to less quality, even though we can have people, pushing for increasing the quality of government goods. I just feel like that's not going to happen. It's just going to move to more people moving to privatization, and then we're going to fall into the same thing. The people, the areas like, lower income areas will be the people who just stay on the basic income, and then now their schools are going to be bad, and now that's going to become the poverty stricken areas. Whereas the other places where people are going to work and people are going to contribute to society, now they'll be the more wealthy. Where's the balance in that?
Well, I love that you're bringing this up because it's the whole topic for next week. So we're going to spend a whole 2 hours talking about it. I just wanted to point out that there's an important difference between a small tribe and a large scale society with a large scale economy. In a small tribe, we need everyone to contribute, and we use social incentives to get people to contribute. You're going to get shamed and whatever if people know you can contribute more and you're not pulling your weight, that kind of thing. At the level of a large scale economy like the one we have, not everybody knows each other. The social incentives, judging people for not contributing, that kind of thing, it's not going to get people to contribute, at least not in the way that it does at the level of a small tribe. So instead of the social incentives, what we have is money. We use money to pay people to do the contribution. And I think that's fine. And if it ends up being that we don't need everyone to contribute, well, we'll talk about that next week. Let's go to Richard.
Sorry, real quick. I just wanted to clarify, because I'm so sorry. So like, because Austin, what you were saying about like the micro level, wouldn't that just be like the US? So this is the UBI is our currency. So we're the small tribe relative to the world, which is the macro, and then their currency. So our currency cannot be valued without everyone contributing to it, because now it's going to lose its value relative to the other countries. That's how I see it. Again, I know you're saying we're going to talk about it later. I just want to make sure I got that out. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, you can certainly look at the different levels. Like there's a small group, and then there's a medium group, and then there's the level of the whole United States, and then there's the world economy and all of that. And that's all very interesting. Yeah. So Richard, go ahead.
Well, we were talking about different currencies competing against each other. There was a really interesting example of during the Civil War, the currencies floated on how much the progress of the war and after each battle. And there's like if you could find out the outcome of the battle before it got to a certain area, you could like have it sort of like insider trading and trade it off spend all your, say, the Confederate dollars in Maine or something before they heard about the outcome of the battle. And then there's the whole idea of, well, say there's like Chuck E. Cheese or something like that, and you spend $1 and you get 5 tokens, and then you use the tokens to use on like a skee ball machine or something like that. And the tickets that you got for how good you did at the game, you spend it on some sort of prize, like a teddy bear or some blasted thing like that. And then the Chuck E. Cheese or whatever, they use the money that you put into the get 5 tokens and buy those prizes. So the whole economy would function like that.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, money is just tokens, right? That you can use to claim things from the economy. So, or it's tickets that you can use to claim things from the economy. So at Chuck E. Cheese, you get your tickets and you claim things from the prize, desk or whatever. But the dollar is just like that, and these labor certificates in Wörgl, Austria are just like that as well. That's kind of what money is. It's kind of like the standard claim ticket for your economy and your economy's potential output. So we're getting to the end here. I know a bunch of people have their hands raised. So we're going to go around and get final comments from everyone. And if you've been waiting to say something, you can say it. Yeah, so final thoughts on the Wörgl experiment, basic income, anything we talked about today. Obviously we didn't get to the article. If there's anything, that we didn't cover and you have some insight that you want to offer or more questions that we can ask for people who are watching this and you want them to come away with this asking a question, you can do that. Yeah, so I'd recommend, if you haven't read the article, to check it out. It's short and it's good. And yeah, so let's go in the order. Martin, Derek, Janae, Richard, Soraya, and then we'll keep going from there. So go ahead, Martin, final thoughts.
So I don't have much to add. For whatever reason, it popped into my head, the postage stamp and if you will, the brilliance of the postage stamp. It costs a lot more money to deliver a first-class letter to an address in North Dakota than it does, say, to mail a letter from one side of Manhattan to the other. But it's not priced that way. And if letters were priced based on the cost of where they were going, we wouldn't have a postal system. In fact, we didn't. And so there is, at least in thinking of UBI, at least a little element like that, where the simplification is actually the genius.
Cool, I like that. Thanks, Martin. Let's go to Derek.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of did a half and a half here, Wörgl, and also just broadly basic income in general, a lot to think about. I love talking about this stuff, by the way. So if anyone wants to talk about this outside of the meeting hours, please hit me up on Twitter or something. But yeah, I guess the final note I had about the Wörgl was that, I mean, some people in the discussion expressed the concern about work and people contributing and that sort of thing. And I think it's important to note too in this example that more spending can actually enables people to do work that want to do work but can't because the money isn't there. And we see this in the Wörgl experiment. The Wörgl currency actually, it wasn't really, they called it a labor ticket. It didn't, as far as I could tell, it wasn't, while it was originally issued to the economy for labor, the actual effects of it were caused by the fact that it motivated people to spend it as consumers somewhere else or as hirers potentially. So it's actually simply the fact that it was spent more that activated labor resources, people that were there and actually kind of wanted to be put to use but couldn't because their economy didn't have enough of the tickets that it was using to pay people. And on that sense, you know, I like to think about it. I like to try to differentiate between work. This is a separate thing, but I like to differentiate between work and wage labor. We can think of wages, money paid is kind of the economy's way of paying you, right? The economic machine has decided it needs something, and then it's going to pay a person to contribute to it. There's lots of other ways too, though, that people can be busy productively. There's a lot of ways in which people encourage each other to work, and that usually happens on a more local level. It doesn't happen on the level of the giant national machine. And so the way I like to think of it sometimes, and maybe a different way from sometimes how Alex presents it, is that as that economic machine, the national infrastructure machine gets more efficient, we give a little bit more room back to people to do other kinds of work, volunteer work, local community work just as groups of friends who are, you know, doing things for each other, cooking for each other, helping out around the house, doing whatever. It gives people more time to do that other kind of work. And I think we get into problems when we conflate the social desires we have to kind of make sure everyone's living up to their potential, like our friends, our community members. When we conflate that with what the economy does, paying people wages to be for an efficiency's sake, we want to try to look at those as separate. So those are just what I was thinking.
Cool, I like it. We'll do Janae, Richard, Soraya, then Mom, and then Elizabeth.
Hello. Wow, Derek, thank you for that kind of summary. That was awesome and helped because I was kind of in and out. I got a phone call, so I missed a bit. Also, thank you, Bethany, for asking a lot of questions. Clearly, I did not understand the article, so I appreciate you asking those questions. That helped. The final thoughts is I'm just really looking forward to next week. That sounds like a really interesting topic that Soraya has touched on. So, yep, this has been awesome.
Okay, great. Thanks, Janae. Let's go to Richard.
Actually, there was a system right before Charlemagne took power in around the 7th or 8th century AD that they had a stick, and then they sort of like a popsicle stick, and they split in half and they put them together, and they based it off of how much grain they put in the granary, and since the rats and things ate the grain, the amount of the stick was worth less for a period of time. And so something like that existed way before Wörgl, and the people actually had better health and things before the Charlemagne instituted his like gold currency and things, and you had to their health actually deteriorated after that because they had to pay their taxes in gold.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, so the Wörgl, you know, they let you pay the taxes and the labor certificates. So the fact that they had that flexibility makes a big difference. Interesting history there. Thanks, Richard. Let's go to Soraya, then Mom, then Elizabeth, then Austin.
Yeah, I legit can't wait till next week and just to keep having these conversations because this is so interesting. Yay, Corona, because I don't know if I would have been involved in this had it not been for this pandemic, and I'm, have much more time at home. So yes, I am so for UBI. I think that it is a great tool to, encourage the economy. But again, I'm a social worker. I'm always going to look at it from a social perspective and not just a straight consumer or financial part. One of the biggest issues with social work is access to resources. So yes, giving people money, great. But again, I just don't want it to keep I think Austin had brought it up before, like going down a rabbit hole. I like what you said, Derek, about, yeah, we got to look at it as, you know, two different things. This is an economic thing, this is a social thing, but they do intertwine. Nothing works in a vacuum. So by, you know, our government implementing something like UBI, now is it taking away all these other resources? And then we have to, like, you know, weigh out the costs and benefits to all that, or, and again, inflation and everything. So again, love this conversation. Please continue to send information. Everyone out there, please keep doing research and let's get this going.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Soraya. Let's go to Mom, Elizabeth, Austin, and then Eddie.
Thanks, Alex. It was a great conversation.
Okay, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm also super excited for next week. I have like a lot of responses to Soraya's concerns, which I will table until next week. But I do really appreciate Derek's like differentiation of work and wage labor. I will say in terms of like the concern about getting rid of social services and stuff, I think that I appreciate Austin's point about how like, yeah, like there's like, if the right is the one like implementing it, then yeah, it's going to be a lot of cutting social services. But like Alex will often talk about how there's like, you know, UBI isn't going to solve everything. And so like we can implement a UBI and be like, okay, cool, we'll like keep all the current social services and then see how stuff pans out and be like, okay, so maybe we're able to have like a UBI where everyone's making like $30,000 a year. And so like, we don't have as much need for like food stamps and other programs because people don't actually need them, but like maybe there's other stuff, you know, like, okay, well, we still need social workers because, you know, that's, people have more money, but they also have other issues going on that need social workers. And so just wanted to put that out there. I feel like I had another thought, but I forgot it. So I'll try to remember it by next week.
Well, all right. Thanks, Elizabeth. We'll go to Austin and then Eddie.
I put my hand up when Soraya was talking earlier about, you know, we need people to make sure people are still working. Derek's kind of addressed it, but I just wanted to throw a couple of examples on top, right, really quickly. So if someone is working the night shift rather than taking care of their own children and doing child raising, I think we can all agree that that's not the best possible use of their labor. So, you know, wage labor doesn't necessarily get people to do the most valuable thing they could be doing. I know that I used to work as a journalist, and I used to try and make a lot of income from writing articles, and the quality of the articles that I wrote then, I don't think is anywhere near as good as when I said, screw this, I'm just going to write what I like and not try and make money off it. And I could actually, then the content became more interesting and original and less, you know, clickbait garbage. Not that my work was ever garbage, but, you know, there's a spectrum of quality versus what's gonna plug into the existing labor market. And a lot of the time, the labor market isn't a perfect way to motivate labor. And yeah, I know that's sort of tangential to what we'll be talking about next week, so I'm excited about that too.
Cool. All right, let's go to Eddie.
So I for one really appreciate you know, all the concerns that Soraya brings up, because I think it's really important to bring up those concerns and not just to kind of paper over them, even though we're all for basic income here. And I think that there is a common misconception that a UBI society is a workless society, that a UBI society is one where we start paying UBI and then everybody stops working and just lets the robots do the thing. And that might be kind of ultimate endpoint in 20 or 30 years, but it's not you know, it's not exactly I think what would happen directly. And I like to say that, you know, paying people UBI is paying people to put other people to work. And if you look at the effect of productivity growth in our society, there's two. You know, one is that the businesses are able to get their products out with less labor, and the other is that the laborers, you know, lose that job in the transaction, so they have less money to spend. And so the result of that is that, you know, I don't think that people are you know, poorer in our society than they really have to be because they're lazy or they don't want to work. I think that they are poor in our society because the labor market is very, very slack, because the productivity growth has made made it so that the businesses don't need that much labor. So when people are looking for a job, the businesses are looking around, oh, we don't really need much labor, we don't really need much labor, but if we can work for, $10 an hour, then, we'll find some people to do. On the other hand, if everybody's getting UBI, there's a great deal more spending going on, then the businesses get put to work, and they in turn have to put people to work. They compete more for the labor, and the wages will actually go up. And so I don't think people will be sitting around. I think wages will go up to compensate, and people will go to work because because they can make a lot of money going to work. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks,
That's
Eddie.
all I'll say for now. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess I have kind of one more comment about the Wörgl experiment. Oh, did I skip Bethany? Go ahead, Bethany.
Yeah, I won't say much because I have a lot of great thoughts, but I think a lot of them apply to next week, so I've written them down. So actually, I was just going to say, I would like you, Alex, to summarize the key takeaways from the experiment, since we didn't talk about it that much. And maybe you were about to do that, but I somehow had to say things anyway. So thanks, Alex.
Okay, yeah, I can do that. And I'm sorry I skipped you. It turns out I had you first on the list and you were scrolled off the top. So I only saw Martin's name there. You were supposed to go first. Yeah, you were too high on my priorities. That was the problem. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot to take away from the Wörgl experiment. The main thing is that they kind of found this hack to get more currency circulating in their economy and activate their economy during the Great Depression. And that's kind of the key thing, and it's something that's very similar to what basic income does. Basic income activates the economy more directly from the consumer side and only to the extent necessary to support consumers, whereas maybe the Wörgl labor certificate currency, since it's spent in through the labor market, it's activating people getting money through the labor market and more kind of production in the economy and infrastructure and stuff that way. So I think that's the main thing. One thing I want to point out, which might not be obvious immediately, is that the demurrage on the currency acts as a tax in much the same way that inflation is a tax. So if the purchasing power of your currency just through inflation is going down and down and down, that's equivalent to kind of a tax on the money that people hold. Inflation is a tax on the money that people hold, and this 1%, demurrage that you have to pay on the labor certificates, that's also a tax on the money that people hold. The big difference is that, or one of the big differences is that if you're doing it the Wörgl way, then your pricing standard doesn't change. Your prices don't have to adjust to match inflation, that kind of thing. But the taxation side of it is roughly equivalent to if you had inflation. So just something to kind of think about. And then whether you can use inflation to get money circulating, and I think you can in kind of a similar way. So this was a great discussion. I know a lot of people have a lot more questions and things they want to talk about. So I want to remind everyone that we have a Facebook group. So people are welcome to share articles and start discussion threads on there. It's facebook.com/Boston Basic Income. So yeah, so next week we're talking about idleness and leisure, and I'm really looking forward to that. And thanks for sticking around, even though we went a little bit over. And I'll see you guys next week.
Bye, Alex.
Thanks, Alex. Bye, everybody.
Bye.